that this is the landscape-led planning and design session brought to you by the Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre Summer Learning Programme. Can we pass over to the next slide? That would be fantastic. Great. So this, I'd just like to say that today's session is brought to you by the Local Government Capacity Centre's Summer Learning Programme. I won't read through this slide, but this is their vision and their mission. I'll just leave you for a second to read that. Fantastic. Before we move on, I'd just like to say I'm in the Development Directorate supporting the Local Government Capacity Centre, and my particular interest in this subject today is that I'm working on a new garden settlement for 5,000 new homes and all the associated facilities, and we're using a landscape-led approach, and we're working in collaboration with the local authority and other stakeholders. So I'm really excited to hear about the speaker's experience and take home some points, and also to hear from yourselves. So hopefully it'll be a really good collaboration. Next slide, please. So this is today's agenda. I'll just quickly go through it. We started at 11, we're finishing at 12:30. We've just had the introduction by myself, Leslie Banfield from Homes England. We'll move on to Sue Morgan from the Landscape Institute, and she'll give us a brief introduction. Then we're going to move to an overview with Dr. Bridget Snaith, and then we're going to go and look at some actual case studies, and we've got Cater Park with Katarina Earn, a scheme in London, which is really interesting. And then we're going to move over to Bradford, a city, and Richard Middleton's going to talk about all the things that the local authority have been doing there, which I'm sure will be of interest to many of the attendees, because mainly this is targeted at local authorities, but we're also pleased to have people from other organisations here as well today. And then we're going to have a question and answer session that's going to be facilitated by Victoria, and then at the end I'll just tie up the loose ends. So with no further ado, I'll pass on to the next speaker, Sue. Thank you.
Hi there, thank you, Leslie, and thank you everybody for attending today's summer programme. Delighted to be here, and again, thank you for all turning up and showing such great interest into everything landscape. I trained as a landscape architect, but I've spent most of my working career, about 25 years plus, working in urban renewal with local authorities, private sector and voluntary sector, and I started work at the LI last September after working at Design Council as interim CEO and Director of Architecture and Built Environment. Next slide, please. So we're here today to examine what is landscape-led design and planning, and why it's important to place landscape at the heart of schemes and plans, and what outcomes can be achieved when taking this approach. And I'm delighted to hear that Leslie is working on a scheme at the moment that puts landscape at the heart. So these two bullet points probably sort of reference things that you may know already, that investment in landscape architecture, planning, management improves existing housing stock. Also actually contributes well to aspects around climate change and biodiversity. But also investment in landscape architecture, planning and management creates community as well as sustainable and resilient, healthy places. Next slide, please. And I know that we have got an interactive poll later on where we're going to be sort of asking you about your sort of immediate experiences with working with the landscape profession. So before we get on to our speakers, I just want to briefly talk to you about the Landscape Institute and what we are and who we are. So we're a chartered body for the landscape profession. Our aim is to work through our members to protect, conserve and enhance the natural and built environment for public benefit. We provide a professional home for all landscape practitioners, including landscape scientists, planners, managers, architects and urban designers. We're also an educational charity that promotes art and the science of landscape practice. Next slide, please. So our mission is to lead and inspire the profession to deliver for the benefit of people, place and nature today and for future generations. We've got nearly 6,000 members at the Landscape Institute practicing in the UK and overseas. They include, individuals and small practices, as well as larger registered practices like Atkins, Arabs, ACOM, etc. But also smaller registered practices like LDA, Gillespie's, and then from sort of large practices down to sort of single practitioners. We also work with accredited universities and other key stakeholders, which I'll come on to in a second. Next slide, please. So what do we actually do at the Landscape Institute? Our current corporate strategy focuses on 3 strategic themes: influence, relevance, and inclusive growth. And in terms of how we work with our members, in terms of our services, we have member services, education standards, and policy and research. And clearly, working with our members, we're actually, as well as those member benefits, we importantly work for, will help commissioners like yourselves, the LI offers professional chartership, a code of conduct and ethics, and continuing professional development, which means that when you are commissioning landscape architects, designers, landscape planners, and landscape professionals, you get the highest standard of professionals. We offer support and technical guidance and practice notes for our members and for our accredited educational partners, ensuring that we continue a pipeline of landscape professionals. Absolutely important for dealing with the substantial challenges of climate change, adaptation and mitigation, embodied carbon, net zero, ESG, sustainability, and creating inclusive places. We also work with other partners and stakeholders collaboratively to produce research and policy. Key work this year is around looking at embodied carbon in landscape. And another key piece of work that we're doing is our sector skills survey, which we've reached out to a number of local authorities to understand how you are working with landscape professionals. We also work to convene, network and collaborate to generate thought leadership and policy and best practice with our members and non-members. And one way this manifests itself is through our annual awards, where we celebrate best practice here in the UK and abroad, which also supports, how commissioners can sort of look at sort of getting the best out of their local authority developments. Next slide, please. So this is where we get interactive, and we have a couple of polls for you to consider. So poll number 1, which I believe is going to come up in your chat, and you can actually vote on that on a scale 1 to 5. So how often do you work with a landscape architect, planner or manager? More than twice a year, once a year, never, do not know. So if you'd like to participate in that poll, and those results will come up in the chat, it'd be really interesting and actually sort of be also helpful to LI about sort of how we need to work with our local authorities. So it'd be really interesting to see what those results are. And I think perhaps Victoria will be sort of helping me see what's actually coming in terms of those results.
Absolutely. So we've got 49% of people so far saying more than twice a year, 9% twice a year, 16% once a year, 20% never, and 4% do not know. So we've got, it's creeping up, it's changing, but still we've got 49% more than twice a year, which is obviously the biggest percentage there.
Really interesting, and in some ways I guess that should be kind of benchmark against how many developments warrant using sort of landscape architects, planners and managers, and are they sort of, is it a standard approach to sort of use them, or are they a sort of adjacent? But whilst we're looking at those and thinking about what that means, our second poll, just move that out of the way, how often do you appoint a landscape architect, planner or manager? So nuance between these two questions. Working with or appointing could be looked at the same thing, but actually physically appointing them as part of your procurement and tender process. So again, more than twice a year, once a year, never, or don't know. So if you could please participate in that poll, that would be amazing to sort of see what results are coming in for that. I've got the hang of this now. I just need to go to view results. So let me see what we're getting coming in here. So appointing a landscape architect, planner and manager. So there's significantly less, and we've got never is 49%. So that's really interesting, slightly depressing. But clearly part of this summer programme is to sort of help local authorities and others really describe the wealth of practice that our landscape professionals can offer in transdisciplinary and intersectionality in terms of some of those bigger development projects and some of the smaller community-based grassroots projects as well that you're grappling with. Okay, so Victoria, do you want to pick up some more on the poll here?
Yeah, so it looks like now we've got, as you said, quite a reversal with 49% never appointing, 12% more than twice a year, 4% twice a year, 21% once a year, and then 12% do not know. So quite a shift from the first question.
Yeah, really, really interesting, and one I think that our panelists, our speakers, could speak about actually when we get to the questions time. It'd be really interesting to see why that is a bit of a reverse and why we don't end up getting to sort of be appointed. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to sort of see if that comes out in some of the questions and answers at the end. If we're okay with the polls, then I'd suggest that I hand over to our first speaker, who's Dr. Bridget Snaith. So Bridget is studying in Sheffield, and Bridget's got an amazing set of slides for us in talking about our overview to landscape design. So over to you, Bridget.
Oh, thanks very much, Sue. I hope everyone can hear me. So yes, my name's Dr. Bridget Snaith, and I am a university lecturer at the University of Sheffield in the landscape department there. But I also am a partner in a landscape practice, and I've been a landscape practitioner for the last 30 years with Shape Landscape Architecture most recently. And as part of that work, I sit on design review panels, providing advice for local authorities that are looking at major schemes, very often major residential schemes. So the introduction and overview that I'm going to give you today is based on that experience. And hopefully, if you do know already a great deal about landscape architecture, it'll provide some at least visually interesting slides and materials to look at, and some references that you might choose to look up later. So next slide, please. So landscape architects and landscape architecture generally is engaged with ideas about environments for living. And as we consider the landscape for development, we aren't thinking just about the site within the boundary, but as landscape architects, we think about connections to the living world more broadly, and we think holistically about people, place, and nature. We do consider then the wider context, and we consider connections beyond the site boundary, to think about the environment as a connected piece, about connections for water, about connections for non-human life. We think about the site as part of a natural landscape, even when we're working in urban environments, and we think about it as part of human lives. The illustration on the right here is taken from the East London Green Grid, which is a planning study produced in London, looking at connected green and blue infrastructure and how it can support sustainable growth in housing and industrial development. Next slide, please. So, as I've said, we consider connections between people, place and nature, and we're always seeking to positively benefit all of them with our work. We have to think, in order to do this, across scales, from the regional, as we saw on the previous slide, through to the local, as this plan on the right illustrates, and even down to the human-centered in terms of the size or detailed design of an individual chair. And we're also thinking for the long term. Plants take a long time to grow and establish, and we're thinking about communities for the long term. So our holistic thinking and integrated understanding of places makes landscape architecture as a profession very well placed to inform sustainable housing developments, particularly in the context of climate change. Next slide, please. So one important aspect of landscape architects thinking around climate change is the role of green and blue spaces in environmental regulation, thinking about how planting and soft landscape most inform the air quality, water quality surrounding developments and in urban settings, and also regulating heat and mitigating and controlling floodwater runoff. So the different terms are used to think about these services that are provided by green and blue spaces. There are terms like ecosystem services or green infrastructure. Sometimes you might hear about natural capital accounting, where we're thinking about how green and blue infrastructure could be valued alongside, for example, the kind of engineering solutions that might otherwise need to be produced. And another way of talking about this environmental regulation function of the landscape is nature-based solutions. But what we know is that plants can filter the air that we breathe, capturing particulates and helping to improve air quality. Water conservation in the climate emergency will be of increasing importance. We're looking at drier summers and wetter winters. And if we are trying to keep shading with plants in our environment, they'll need to have water directed to them. One of the great ways we can do this is by capturing grey water, for example, from road runoff or from roofs. But that could potentially pollute wider systems. Planting can be used then to clean it, to ensure that the water is of good quality and can be reused. And with intense rainfall, upstream storage, holding the water back, stopping it overburdening the sewage systems is really important. And soft landscape, again, can be part of controlling the speed at which floodwaters are released. So we see now most developments include what are called SUDs, Sustainable Urban Drainage Systems. And in this image, you can see a SUD system here in the Derbyshire Street Pocket Park, a really small one, but one that's also going to be important for biodiversity. There are also green roofs, rain gardens, swales, and these provide attractive, multifunctional on-site water storage. And then in terms of urban cooling, planting like tree cover can be really important, but also vertical climbers. And if the climbers and trees are deciduous, they provide shade in the summer months when it's necessary, but they'll allow light in the winter and allow heat into homes. Next slide, please. Another aspect of landscape-led design which can impact on the climate emergency is thinking about active travel, making sure that when we're designing places that we consider connections to walking and cycling routes, or even establishing them in the first place, because what we want to see is that walking and cycling or active travel are the first choice for frequent short journeys, such as to school or to the shops. And at the same time, landscape-led design aims to prioritise clear routes to public transport for longer journeys. And all of these things, active travel is about helping promote active and healthy lifestyles, again, improving air quality, reducing the carbon footprint of developments, but also, importantly, providing equality of opportunity for young people who can't drive, or for lower income people who don't have access to cars, that they can also make those journeys easily. Now, many developments are shaped by markets that favour space for cars, but in terms of planning for the future, prioritising active travel is really important, even if you're meeting a market preference, because it will allow for future lifestyle changes. And if this isn't thought about at the outset, ultimately it can make it very difficult for people to live well into the future. So we do need to look forward and support change, even for rural or suburban landscape areas where there may not currently be a great deal of existing infrastructure for active travel. It's important to be looking forward and connecting spaces and thinking about making that first move to establish those active travel strategies. Another, next slide, please, sorry. Another aspect of landscape thinking is about biodiversity. So biodiversity isn't just nice to have, it's actually crucial for meeting the challenges of climate change, because we don't know, as the climate change, which plants will become susceptible to the stresses of a changed environment and which will thrive. And in order to secure our future with these environmental regulation services, then biodiversity is the best strategy for future-proofing green infrastructure. Developments have now got the need to deliver 10% of a net gain in biodiversity from before the development until after it. And the calculations will be based on metrics. However, landscape architects will also work really closely with ecologists and other specialists to ensure that not just people's connections are made, but also ecological connections are made beyond the development boundary to help secure a net gain of biodiversity beyond the site boundary, as well as by thinking about the range of habitat types that are important locally and nationally, so that integrated functions happen beyond the site, as I've said. Next slide, please. And as well as those important functions for the natural environment, beauty for everyone is really important for public health, for inclusion and for well-being. And I think following on from the COVID pandemic, we're really aware of the importance of access to outside space for those. So many people's main opportunity to connect with natural space is in everyday space around their homes. And so when we're thinking about landscape design, it's really important that people can feel safe outside and that they're encouraged to move through and spend time in the natural environment, which is really beneficial for their health and well-being. So beautiful space for everyone needs to have good circulation. It needs active, playful routes for people to access space, to visit shops and schools, as I've said, safe from cars. There need to be clear gradients between private and public space. There needs to be good overlooking of outdoor space and clear sight lines ahead to help build confidence and prevent antisocial behaviour from developing. People need cared for places to pause, to play and exercise, as well as just enjoying contact with nature. And part of making sure that everyone is included in outdoor space means that local people can be included in the process of developing that environment through citizen science, through co-design, and through care in monitoring and the design of engagement activities. So there's an image here of a sort of planning for real exercise that our practice undertook in a London neighbourhood as part of developing improved green space for that local community. Next slide, please. So again, thinking about beauty for everyone and thinking about inclusion and well-being, housing developments need to think about everyone's needs. And not everyone will have the same needs, and some needs might conflict with each other. So the best strategy is to provide varied spaces, places that can allow people to reflect quietly, places where people might grow, places where people can be sociable and perhaps a little more boisterous. Spaces need to consider everyone, single people, young children, older people, teenagers, and that needs to think about not just kickabout spaces for, you know, the typical teenage boy, but also spaces for girls to socialise, because girls have been found to drop out from activity and can actually be withdrawn from the public realm if spaces aren't thought about with them in mind. We obviously need to consider people with disabilities or limiting conditions, and also people with lower incomes who may not have access or might be living in overcrowded conditions, and the outside space then functions like a garden or an additional room for that group. We also should be considering different tastes and interests, and all of this is brought about by careful consideration and working with people to try and pick up on what their priorities are, what their knowledge is. The housing landscape can provide huge benefits to communities and the environment, and landscape architects bring their holistic understanding of how to integrate people, place and nature for the long term across a range of scales with creativity and care. So next slide, please. And I'll just finish with an image of a scheme that won a Landscape Institute Award for housing, which is the Aberfeldy Estate. And this is a space in London designed by Levitt Bernstein. And in this image, you can see community space for people to collect together. You can also see a swale. You can see the trees that are there for shading, that there's plenty of opportunity for people to spend time. So now I'm going to hand over to Katarina Ern, and she will talk to you about a project that her practice has worked on in Cater Park. Next slide, please.
Great, thank you, Bridget, and thank you for your wonderful, clear and concise presentation just now that really builds the perfect foundations for the case study that I'm going to talk to you about now, which is Cater Park. If you could get the next slide, please. First of all, a little bit about me. So I'm Katarina Erne. I am a senior landscape architect and associate working for HTA Design, LLP. We are a multidisciplinary company offering services from architecture, landscape architecture, planning, interior design, as well as sustainability. This I mentioned because it is important, because it really also shapes the way we work and the connected thinking that we have, that's really ingrained in our business as a creative collection. So Cater Park, as I said, a case study for landscape biodiversity and housing. I'm first going to talk to you a little bit about what it is, where it is, then how it came about. So it's got a really interesting story of genesis, and then a lot about what we did and why it is good and why we really feel like this needs to be taken out into the world and replicated over and over again in this scale, larger scale or smaller scales. So Cater Park is located in southeast London. It is located in a royal borough of Greenwich. We have designed this in collaboration with Berkeley Homes, who were the client, as well as a London Wildlife Trust, and the Royal Borough of Greenwich equally was involved in this project. Cater Park really is the green spine of Kidbrooke Village, a large £1 billion regeneration project in the borough. It's got just over 5,000 plus homes now that are nestled around the green spine that is Cater Park. There are several parts to Cater Park. I shall talk about this a bit later, but really what you need to know is, so what you see here is the Cater Park after we've biodiversified it, so to speak. And before there was a park there already, but it wasn't a park that people used. In 2016, Berkeley Homes did a survey with their community to see why they came to live in Kidbrooke Village. And 64% answered they came here for access to green spaces. The next question was like, how often you use Cater Park and what you do there? And only 8% said they're actively using Cater Park for play, picnics, or something else. So 64% got there because of access to green space, but no one's using it. that really got Berkeley Homes thinking and going like, okay, something's wrong here, we need to change things. They had a really good partnership with the London Wildlife Trust in the past, so they got the London Wildlife Trust involved to change things and help them rehaul what they're doing. Can we get the next slide, please? Berkeley had a vision, which was biodiversity. So they really wanted to instill biodiversity into development. They were looking for a prototype. And they've done some good work at Woodbury Downs with the London Wildlife Trust already. And then picked Kidbrooke Village with this park that wasn't used to really develop their 9 concepts, which is a strategy they devised 5 years ahead of government legislation to really bring together people, housing, but also nature and biodiversity in a very holistic concept, which for a private developer is rather notable. Can we get the next slide, please? So they started off with the London Wildlife Trust, but then soon it became apparent they needed some landscape architects involved to really help them bring these ideas and concepts to life that they had. So they came to us and asked us to help. And we obviously said, it's our absolute pleasure. We've had some good workings with them in the past. And before we kind of zoomed in into the park itself, it really was important for us to see where the park sits in the overall scheme as part of this nature recovery network of wildlife being able to come into the park as well as plants, and then equally transition soon coming out. We've got Sutcliffe Park in the south, which is an important park in this part of London, and with the Suds, as well as the River Quaggy coming through there. And then what we started looking at, and then just going down a bit more into the detail as we worked ourselves down. And we looked at the diverse habitat mosaics. That's something we then wanted to develop in the park as a tapestry that we lay over. But another thing that was really important to us was to really get this interconnected landscape for nature, but also for people alike to be able to move freely through and within the park. Really important is like, what can we do, to what extent can we go to introduce biodiversity, and that is in flora and fauna. We also wanted to bring along all people of all ages, really important, so not forget about our children, and include as much play, biophilic play, imaginative play in the park as possible. Some in designated play areas, and then others just in letting it open to inspiration of the children to be able to play. And lastly, is as a place to meet for all genders, abilities, and ages, like really a park for everyone. The park itself, all of Cater Park, is 8.1 hectare. What we've transformed thus far is the North Cater Park, which has got the 3.5 hectares, and to come is the South Cater Park. And in North Cater Park, we were able to achieve an absolute staggering 161% net gain. So that's a really, really, really good result, given that this was a park with land before it. And as you might know how biodiversity net gain works, it kind of assesses the baseline, so the current, and then also the proposal. If we can get next slide, please. So this is a view of the park after we've done our work, and you can see already here, just like looking at something lovely and green like this, it just like my whole body just goes, oh, isn't this just wonderful? And that's really the experience that people now have in this park, that we were able to transform so significantly. Can we get the next slide, please? So how did we get there? How did we get to the picture we just showed you? So first of all, we developed a really strong narrative, because we really feel like in order to make landscape accessible, it needs a story. And we created this story in order to get people excited and involved of the chalk stream, which is the Kidbrooke, so that it's now culverted, but a brook that runs past the site in close proximity to the chalk stream. And we've had this chalk stream meandering through the parkland, and then different areas of the kite park and the chalk stream and the heathland that's got to do with the topography of the park and where they sit. And this we overlaid with a tapestry of the habitat mosaic where we created different habitats depending on where we are on the site. So at the very bottom at the south, you see the lowland. It's obviously the lowest part of the site. So we're going to create wet woodlands there as well as SATS features. And then moving up, we have where you see the pink, the heathlands. And then moving further up across the road into chalk stream, a series of SATS features, and then it all ends up in the very top in the north with the highest part, Kite Park, which is this large biophilic play space. Next slide, please. Again, really important is to weave in all these different layers. So it's not only the habitat mosaic, that's just part of this tapestry, of this fabric that we're knitting together for a park. A park needs to do so much more. So we've got the play provision, again, the connectivities, the strong narrative and the topography. So we created a lot of mounds that were so we got rid of 30,000 cubic meters of demolition arisings. I calculated earlier what that translates into in lorries. Let me just see. So that's 2,500 lorries that don't need to go on the London roads. Me as a cyclist, I'm very happy about every lorry less. That we were able to put into the park by creating this interesting topography that then tallies in with this habitat mosaic, making use of these new mounds that then also form part of the play strategy. And then lastly, the character areas that kind of underpin this story that we have. And then on the right, you see before and after. So before, we had a cater park that, as per the survey, only 8% were actively using. And it was a park very traditional of short lawn that go all the way down to the water, very labor-intensive ornamental planting beds. And what we've done, you see below, this is actually one and a half months after the opening, after we've just hydroseeded the bank and put in marginal vegetation on these SATS features. And you see what this park looked after. So it completely transformed the park with this. And then I just saw there was a question about maintenance. So maintenance is really very important to us, to lower the maintenance. So with this transformation, what we've significantly lowered the maintenance. Shortcut grass needs to be cut like 30 times a year, and with what we've done, we've gone to one cut a year, or what you see here, this Kasuki grassland on the edges needs a cut every 3 years. It is more skilled, but is lots and lots less work. Can you get next slide, please? Really important, we can't do this without community engagement. It's absolutely paramount to bring people along every step of the way. First, to consult and get them excited about what's going to happen, keep them informed about the whole process, and actively get them engaged. And we had the London Wildlife Trust on board, and they're wonderful. And that's exactly what they're doing, getting the people excited and informed all the way through the process, and also involved. And going forward, they will be looking after some of the maintenance of the park as well. Next slide, please. The biophilic play space that I already mentioned at the very top of Kite Park, really important. So here we created this stony outcrop with these mounds that we formed, so the birth of this chalk stream that then meanders through the remainder of the park. We were working together with APES, they're the play installers of the Olympic Park, and what you can see is a lot of recycled materials. So we've got stag oak, we've got timber groins that are pulled out of the Woolwich Pier, we've got green heart sleepers recycled from British Rail, all put together into this wonderful, lovely, soft biophilic play space. In the foreground on the right, you see stepping stones, cast iron stepping stones that we did with local school children and then found their way into the park. And it really is important to get all these little details right and think about them and see what can we do to make this place even better and get people involved. And it was wonderful to see this at the opening, just how people use the play space. So if we carry on. a park for people and wildlife alike. So we're not creating just an environment for biodiversity or climate resilient. There really, as designers, we have the powers and the foresight to marry all these strategies together and really create something where everyone can use it and flock to and enjoy the space in equal manners. And if you can get the next slide, please. Really important, as here again, just all this positive feedback we had. What I'm really proud of is it's a multi-award winning scheme. So we not only won the Landscape Institute prize for the Sir David Attenborough Award for Biodiversity, as well as that year the President's Award, which is the overall awards. But one award that I'm very, very personally proud of is actually the British Homes Award, a traditional house builders award, where we got not only the best landscape scheme, but also the Judges Award of Excellence. That just goes to show how much landscape now is valued and the understanding of the added benefits landscape brings. So if we can just move on to the next slide. Closer to nature, so really important for us is also communicating what we're doing in the park to children of all ages. But we've got this wonderfully talented illustrator that devised these panels that are in the park where children can see how the park works and all the intricacies. But also like the perfect storm on Twitter that Cater Park managed to create, which is wonderful. And then the next slide, please. And this is just me saying thank you. So one last thing that I just want to say before I hand over to Richard Middleton is that it's, for me as a landscape architect, there's nothing more beautiful than after all the hard blood, sweat and tears to pull a project like this together over all the years is then to finally go into park and to overhear people just going like, ah, isn't this beautiful? Isn't this wonderful? And to see them enjoy the space that we created. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine. If you want to move to the next slide, thanks. So I'm Richard Middleton. I run regeneration projects from within the City of Bradford Metropolitan District Council's Landscape Design and Conservation team, and I'm here to offer the view from Bradford. Next slide, please. So Bradford, I would imagine most people's perspective of Bradford or what they know about it will be the City of Bradford, its urban core as a former Victorian wall town, become an urban metropolis. But actually, as a district, Bradford is 370 square kilometres of space, and almost 2/3 of it is rural. So our landscape makeup is very, very complex. We include special designation sites such as Oakley Moor. We have a World Heritage Site of Saltaire, alongside our urban fabric. Next slide, please. So we have almost 550,000 people within the borough, and within that makeup is quite a diverse community. So, and also a really young community. So a quarter of our population is under 18 years of age. But we also suffer a significant amount of deprivation within our urban communities. This is not borne out with what happens within our rural communities. You'll see here from the heat map that it's the urban communities that seem to suffer the deprivation, not the rural ones. And there are significant public health inequalities that we have to manage. It's some of the data suggests that a woman living in one of the most deprived areas can expect to live 9 years less than her equivalent in the rural communities. And for a man, that healthy life expectancy increases the gap to 11 years life expectancy difference. So our placemaking activity has to address some of these social issues that we have within Bradford's society. Next slide, please. So the Landscape Design and Conservation team perhaps doesn't sit within Bradford Council structure in a way that you might imagine. You would perhaps think the landscape designers would sit alongside architects and quantity surveyors within an estates team, or maybe sits alongside the teams that manage the green spaces within the borough. But actually, the landscape design team sits with colleagues in planning, transport and highways within a department of place that is specifically designed to bring all of the placemaking services together. So there is a sense that it's felt that it's more important that the landscape designers sit alongside the planners in shaping the place, even though they also have a role in delivering projects. Next slide, please. So within Bradford, our planning policy is maturing. We're not far away from being able to adopt a local plan. Our core strategy was adopted recently, but we've also in 2020 secured, by working with Tybalds, a homes and neighbourhoods design guide specifically intended to help developers to understand the specific challenges of working within Bradford. Within that, green spaces are one of the 8 priorities that are identified, but also landscape issues appear in several of the priorities that sit within that document. We were acknowledged in 2019 as a future place, one of 5 within the UK. That was a programme that was run by the Royal Institute of British Architects, the Royal Town Planning Institute, Local Government Association. And with, again, our particular placemaking need was centred here about how we develop a relationship with our diverse community. So we ended up developing a placemaking toolkit specifically designed to work with the broadest ranges of our community, and in particular the hard to reach sections of our community that often don't engage within planning issues and placemaking issues. I'd also like to just to drop a little hot off the press item in that we've actually become a design code pathfinder authority only about a month ago. So that's a year-long project that we'll be developing. And I think the feeling is that the design code that we're developing, which again is around housing and regeneration, will be a reflection of the fact that we have a obviously recently implemented design guide. So it's how we can shift from a design guide to a design code. Next slide, please. Within Bradford, we see a lot of our work that we do within landscape has to be innovative. It has to be progressing things and moving things forward. And so we quite often seek to work with like-minded professionals and other groups. And that's seen as joined several international projects. The Interreg Begin project is one of the projects that we joined up. It's only recently just come to an end. It involves transnational learning. So we're sharing our expertise with partners from other nations, but we're also gathering their experience to bring to it. So Begin was specifically looking about mitigation of extreme weather conditions within the urban environment and how we link to the community. So how we engage the community in these conversations, how we get them on board with the projects that we're doing. But this was also an interesting project in that it forced us to look back on ourselves within the council and ask the question about how the different departments and services within the council work together and relate to one another. The next slide, please. One of the pilot projects that came out of Begin is Naturalising Bradford Beck. Fundamentally, this is a highway scheme. This is the need to remove a box culvert on a river that was in poor condition, that's right next door to a road that's going to be significantly improved. And that box culvert was a structural issue for the highways team. It was also a flooding issue for the potentially for the highways team. If it had been left to just a highways project, undoubtedly they would have simply taken out the culvert, put in a new concrete channel, and they would have achieved all of their outputs for the highway scheme. But by engaging with landscape designers and with local community stakeholders, the Friends of Bradford Beck in this instance, we were able to turn that team and develop a proposal that allowed us to bring in additional funding such that we're no longer looking at an engineered solution, we're looking at a natural solution to replanning the river. Within Bradford, as I stated, the public health challenges are a significant thing that we have to deal with. And we've been forging strong relationships with groups within our local community. We're very fortunate. We have a health research institute that's been conducting a birth cohort study now, and they've identified how access to green space has a significant impact on early childhood development and better healthcare outcomes. So they've developed the Better Place project, which is looking to create these play spaces. The council have placed a landscape architect within that team to assist and deliver. Join Us Move Play or Jump is a Sport England initiative looking at teenagers and how they access space. Again, we're feeding landscape projects into there. And again, we've joined a European project, Urbac Healthy Cities, which is looking to develop an integrated action plan for Bradford that looks at what steps we can take to improve the health of our citizens and visitors by changes we make within the urban environment. And there's a really interesting offshoot project that's come out of that called a Healthy Cities Generator that allows people to assess their projects in terms of what health potential public health benefits they will achieve. One of the projects that we got through Join Us Move Play, as I mentioned, is about play spaces. And this is a typical one that we've achieved. We know it as Scotchman Play Park, but actually such is the engagement with the community that they've already taken it on board and retitled it Kashmir Park to reflect the community that it represents. Next slide, please. Another European project that we're linked into is Life Critical. This is a link to climate resilience issues, and it's looking at how we can use our parks within the urban environment to better improve climate resilience for the neighbouring communities. The challenge here is, again, working with the local community. If you ask them what they want for a park, they may well focus on toilet provision or play equipment, but we need them to ask questions about, do we introduce sustainable drainage systems, increased tree cover? That might not be their priorities, but that's what we look to achieve through a project like Life Critical. Next slide, please. We obviously have significant urban regeneration projects ongoing. These are often rely heavily on external funding being brought into a system. So the project that I run on a day-to-day basis is a townscape heritage scheme, which is supported by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. We've also been able to bring in match funding from the European Structural Investment Fund to take a scheme where we're looking at an urban location within the city centre that's struggling because of the change of the retail drivers within that are affecting all of the cities around the UK and the reduction in the requirement for bricks and mortar retail. So we're looking at how we can introduce a more desirable landscape that actually increases footfall and increases the desire of people to stop and pause and enjoy these spaces. Next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of finally draw on a little bit of how we actually within Bradford are looking to use that innovation to develop our projects and move things forward for us. We've received quite a lot of recognition for what we've done. A tree planting project, A Tree for Every Child, planting 55,000 trees over the last couple of years, was produced was actually sort of presented on BBC Countryfile programme, along with some of the stories around the Better Place project and how creating green spaces are actually helping our children within Bradford to better develop. Our landscape design and conservation team leader, Sarah Alley, was awarded the Emerging Star, the inaugural Emerging Star champion position by Sustrain for her engagement with sustainable drainage systems. And the Begin project received Regio Stars Awards. And you might think, well, that's just recognition, it's nice, it's great. But it actually opens doors. We find it helps us to actually then engage with the next project that we need to move forward with. And I think that's really my last slide. So I think at this stage, I'm going to hand back to Sue Morgan to draw this whole presentation to a conclusion.
Thank you so much. I think you'll all agree we've had some absolutely amazing speakers, and thank you for the reactions. It's great to see sort of applause coming up for our amazing speakers. Truly fascinating, and a great breadth of different types of practice as well, from the overview right through to looking at something not London based as well as London based. So thank you so much for all those speakers. I think there's some amazing comments and questions in the chat, which hopefully we'll be able to sort of get to. And I think some of us have been actually sort of answering some of those things in the chat as well as we go through. And I'm looking forward to the panel Q&A session in a moment. One thing, just to answer some of the sort of direct comments, if we could have the next slide, please. One of the things about sort of the Landscape Institute is we've got a wealth of case studies and policy practice and some guidance, which, you know, not all is behind paywalls, and not all is not available to non-members. So, you know, just a great opportunity for those on the call to sort of learn a little bit more about what we do at the Landscape Institute, help us participate in CPD, look at best practice on Allied Campus, get access to research and reports, and we're also always up for people to sort of help write our quarterly journal, but also our weekly newsletter as well. So just the sort of information that hopefully will help support some of the questions and comments around where to get sort of aspects around good case studies and good practice. And those on the call, those speakers are also sort of associated with the Landscape Institute. So it's great to see. And Bradford certainly have got some really fantastic champions working at Bradford who really understand landscape and place making. And you can really see how that's manifested itself in the way that local plans and the way that the structure is developed, and that place goes into all aspects of the sort of master planning and design development. So I'll just draw that bit to a close, and if I can ask Victoria to come in and now sort of help us curate some of the Q&A panel. And I think colleagues are going to now turn on their cameras and join us, I think.
Thanks, Sue. So we've had lots of questions in the chat, which is great. I'm going to take make my way through the questions, and some of these I think will be appropriate for particular speakers, and then some it'd be great to hear what the whole of the panel thinks. We'll start off with this first question. And it asks, how should approaches vary when considering rural schemes versus urban? And wondering whether Sue can start us off with that first question.
Yeah, I think I can start us off, but then I think I'm actually going to sort of look at most of the colleagues on the panel, actually, because they've all got various different experiences of the two. And I think Richard actually sort of indicated quite clearly in his slides about you know, the distinctiveness around having cities, but also rural aspects as well. But I suppose two overarching points for me, and then I'll open it up to others, is you know, we know globally that cities are going to become more and more under pressure by increased populations over the next couple of decades, and we need to make our cities more equitable and comfortable, as well as dealing with the sort of immediate aspects around climate, so cooling, heating, flooding and drought, and all those aspects around climate change that we're going to sort of see manifest themselves. And it's interesting to see so many schemes coming through in Europe and in Asia where they really are beginning to embrace the need to use landscape as a whole systems approach to making cities more hospitable and spongier, and, you know, more equitable for people living in them. So that's one aspect, and I think the other aspect is in some ways they're the same design principles. So if you think back to Bridget's slides, where we're talking about, equitable landscapes, accessible landscapes, landscapes that encourage active travel, landscapes that encourage, being seen as critical infrastructure to sort of help people navigate from one space to another, spaces that are, I'm not going to say, well, I am going to say the word beautiful, but looking at, beautifully designed places that people can enjoy, which sort of also enhances, people's health and well-being, but also helps sort of commercial activity. And in some ways, there's no difference in terms of those design principles, rural and urban, and both rural and urban have that opportunity of really making a difference into our biodiversity crisis as well as our climate change crisis. But let me pass over perhaps to Bridget's now in Sheffield, and Richard, you're in Bradford as well.
Yeah, I think from Bradford's perspective, the issues with climate change are no different from the urban environment to the rural environment. We're seeing climate change issues affecting our rural environment. So with our Oakley Moor, we're recently having to institute works to actually control water runoff because that may well affect some of our flooding issues within the Aire Valley. So some of the challenges are the same, but it's fair to say there are always going to be specific character elements that are fundamentally different between urban and rural sites and opportunities. So I think you need to look at the underlying character of the area to inform some of the project changes as you move forward. But the challenges that society faces, they're going to be the same whether you're urban or rural.
Just to come in a little on that, I mean, I think as a practitioner, one of the key differences is the availability of transport options for rural communities. And I think that it's worth noting the changes in micro transport options. Electric bikes are making the possibility of cycle transport and deliveries and so forth actually quite viable, even in areas with difficult hills like Sheffield. And I think, thinking strategically about what might be possible and trying to make those moves with any development that comes forward, thinking to the future, how could we implement something here that's part of what could come, what's part of a strategic vision for transport. The things might not be there right now, but as things come forward, having that vision and thinking holistically is really important part of development, so that rural lives aren't constrained by the availability or the ability to drive or the potential for publicly funded transport. If we can get down to those micro solutions, we might be really making a big change.
Thank you. Great. I think we'll move on to the next question. And for this, I'd like to introduce Lee Haycoop. Now, Lee hasn't spoken through the main body of the session, but she's the Homes England Landscape Architect Lead within the design team. So I'm delighted she can join us. And there are two questions in the chat that are quite related in terms of landscape knowledge and how important it is needed within plan making and also with development management. And I was wondering whether Lee could start us off with answering the question, how important is that landscape knowledge for development management? Thanks, Lee.
Hi. Yeah, very interesting question. Of course, it's crucial to have that landscape knowledge, absolutely, in plan making. If it's not there in the local plan, then development management colleagues can't then use that on developers to make them deliver the landscape that they would like them to deliver. But I think perhaps it could be shaped up in terms of like, I think planning colleagues and in development management, they kind of, first of all, they need an awareness of what landscape can do, its functions. It's not just, so it, we've had this shift from landscape as just pretty, decorative, sitting on the side of a building, nice to have, to one where it functions for helping the climate emergency, for polluted air, for children and young people's developments in urban environments. It helps the inactivity crisis with all this sort of, green infrastructure, active travel that it facilitates. And of course, we have a biodiversity crisis as well, which must not be down at the bottom of the list. It needs to be top. And luckily, we've got legislation coming in on that. Well, in some cities already, and in London, there's the urban greening factor. You've got biodiversity net gain coming in October 23. So these are major learning curves for plan makers. But last year I was working as an associate, public practice associate at Tower Hamlets, and it was a little bit sometimes disappointing. Some of the wording in the local plan was not strong enough, particularly on SUDs, for example. So I think it's crucially important. Was that question was just on plan making, wasn't it? It wasn't on development management. Have I got that right, Victoria?
Yeah, there were two questions. One was explicitly around plan making, and then another was referring to development management. But they sort of, as you've stated, they do speak to each other. So yeah, I don't know if anybody else from the panel has any further comments or thoughts on that, or whether you do have anything further, Lee.
Yeah, could I just say a bit more about development management? Of course, their tools are the conditions. I mean, a lot of projects come across their desk, and the landscape element of those is it's entirely up to the conditions which development management stipulate that that states the requirements and the asks, so to speak, from the landscape element of the proposed development. So they need their awareness raising about what landscape can do. They need to understand the plans that come across their desks. And I can tell you, having looked at a lot of them last year, some landscape architects' plans are for the developers' landscape architect plans are really great and full of explanations, and others they don't even have an accurate key, and really hard to spot something, and these development management people, they're stressed on time. So that's a piece of work that they need to have consistency, and they need to understand how explicit they can make their conditions. So while I was there, I rewrote their standard landscape conditions, which I think they asked me to do, and I think that would be a great help. And I could also add in specific conditions for the management, because of course, as we know, if something isn't maintained or managed well, it's going down. And luckily, the urban greening factor and biodiversity net gain coming in does require that. So that enabled me to add a column in on the UGF specific to each item to say what development management colleagues could stipulate as a condition for the management of that. And so but I could see how they didn't. I was there for a year, 12 months. That was my post, and I can see how that landscape knowledge is very much needed in local authorities.
Thanks, Lee. Fantastic. So we have another question, and it's from a delivery officer in housing, and it's related to that delivery journey and the next step along thinking about responding to planning requirements. And I'd like to ask this question of Bridget. So I'll read it out for you. It says, I'm a delivery officer in housing, so work with internal landscape architects when determining planning requirements for a site. Then later with developer-appointed landscape architects, grappling with developer-driven instructions, which tend to provide minimal responses to meet planning requirements only. So this tends to result in cost-led rather than design-led solutions. Bridget, do you have any thoughts on that? It's not a direct question, but it would be good to get some of your thoughts in terms of your own experience, thinking about that challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a real challenge. I think that very often landscape architects are brought in at the end of a scheme, and it's an area where cost savings are often thought about, and things that are prioritised in layouts are very often around, as I was saying in the overview that I gave earlier, around have I got enough car parking spaces to sell this house, which isn't really the same thing as thinking about, the long-term vision of how well this might connect to other things and what alternatives there might be, as I was saying. But the role of design review is something that I think many local authorities do value, because in a way, while officers may feel a little more constrained and less able to be robust when developers come forward with schemes that are just not quite as good as they should be, the design review panel, where it includes landscape architecture, can really begin to ask those questions about the relationship to wider strategies for biodiversity action plan for connectivity more widely. And I think that that dialogue between professionals in the design review with planning officers, with the designers who are involved in projects, can really help to sort of change the way that the clients view the landscape and that they think about how they're going to approach a planning application. So I do think that that can be a really useful tool. And I'd also say that my experience, I have worked outside London. I've worked in the Northwest, but I worked in London for the last 20 years before coming here. And the place of supplementary planning guidance, like the All London Green Grid, was extremely helpful, but also metrics around, if you have this number of houses, you must provide this amount of play space. Those things can be really helpful in setting parameters. And again, you know, we've talked about biodiversity net gain is coming in. So some of these methods of calculating in advance can really help and help to create robust planning decisions. That's my answer.
Fantastic, great. Thanks, Bridget. I should say to the panel, do shout with any of these that you think you'd like to respond or make a further comment. But that's really helpful.
Could I just add to Lee and Bridget, actually, I think obviously fundamental is the underscore in terms of planning. But I think Richard, do jump in here because this is your council. But I think Richard illustrated it really clearly that if you have really good champions in your local authority, if your local plan recognises that, you know, landscape is important and can provide multiple benefits, and then you manage to weave that in to multiple policies, multiple departments, and you really have, you know, champions on the ground who understand the comms behind it, as well as the finance imperatives, as well as the sort of long-term stewardship and grassroots involvement, then you're onto a bit of a winner. And I also think there's some really interesting work that's obviously coming out of Bradford, but also out of Manchester at the moment as well, where they've recognised through some of the European projects like Ignition the value and imperative of really enhancing a strategic plan around their green spaces. But they've also recognised that they need to be working with other stakeholders and partners to realise it. So, you know, partnerships with the Land Trust, for example, for long-term stewardship, and, you know, looking at sort of how to create new skills offers and value propositions for new people coming into landscape professions to sort of actually maintain the new green infrastructure that they put in. So I think leadership, embedded policy, I think, yes, absolutely, supplementary planning guidance is really, really useful. Completely endorse what Bridget said, and champions, you know, to take it forward.
I think the champions bit is an interesting one. I focus on the fact that I have a really fantastic team leader who is one of these people, but it shouldn't be understated how much the importance of actually co-design and co-creation with the community is an enabler. If you have the community on your side, then you will have the drivers there. It would have to be the most hard-hearted politician or banker or financier to actually go against what the community is telling people that they need. So actually enabling the community, going down that co-creation, co-design route is a really strong way of embedding good design outcomes for your landscape-led projects, and making sure that if there is value engineering that has to be done, that it isn't the key areas that the community is telling everybody that they want. And that could be a way of actually fundamentally seeing that protection of some of the key aspects of projects that may well be denuded as part of value engineering exercises in the late stages of projects.
Thank you, Richard. I'd like to ask a question and pose a question for Katerina. Now, Katerina, your presentation went down very well in the chat. There was an awful lot there, but quite a few of the people attending were suggesting that it was a very beautiful development. The park looked fantastic, but they were concerned about vandalism, and a few stated, you know, that where I work, that would be vandalised. I was just wondering if you could give us some ideas of how you factored in that the risk of vandalism and factored that into your design and project management, and what your actual experience has been on the ground as well.
Yeah. Sure. So vandalism was a concern from our client as well all the way through the project, but we were able to convince them that if it's done right with the right community involvement and suitably robust materials, then that should be okay. What you've seen there might look very not hardy, but rest assured, like the playground, what we have there, the big timber section, big timber groins, to set that on fire, it's not that easy. To my knowledge, there was tiny bits of vandalism, but really nothing that we expected. And then what was really beautiful to see also, there isn't that much playoff in the area. So we also have a large Muga as part of this playground. We had the local youth coming to it and all the children, and you can really see how they love and protect the place. Interestingly enough, the most vandalism we have from people coming to pick flowers. So they come and pick large bouquets, but luckily enough, we've got plenty of them, so they'll get away with the flower picking. So yes.
Brilliant. Thank you. Fantastic. I have a question for Richard regarding the work in Bradford, which is related in terms of working with the community. And it said, which of the programme worked with teenagers and sports facilities? If I could pose that to Richard.
So the most specific one that's ongoing is the project that's entitled Jump, which is abbreviation for Join Us, Move, Play. So that's Sport England working with health partners. So that's specifically looking at the age group, I think it's about 11 to 19. And that's quite been focused on natural play rather than actually forced to manage play. So getting access to the natural environment. So we've opened up a space by one of the local becks, which really hasn't been accessible for the communities around it. So that's specifically the project that we're looking at. I said the Better Start, Better Place project, that's early years development, but it really means that we have a series of projects and programs. We're fortunate in Bradford to have a series of projects that are looking at different generations within the community and how we support them. So yeah, I mean, if I think we've given a link to the Jump website as some of the guidance, and I can type it again in the chat to make sure if somebody wants to look at it, they can go and find it.
Fantastic. So that practical advice is really helpful. And what you've described is great for such a young and youthful city as well. Thank you. So very last question before we get some feedback from the attendees. So please stay with us. Last question for Sue, if this could be a very quick sort of roundup and almost a rallying cry. So there was a question here, and it says, it was a statement and then question. There's a real shortage of qualified landscape architects and urban designers, ecologists. In fact, many professions are in the same position. How can we encourage more people to train in these areas to ensure that there are enough resources so that we aren't having to retrofit or fight for the benefits of landscape? Yeah, Sue, over to you, if you could give us a short summary of what you think.
So working in landscape and related professions is, it's the best profession in the world. I'm going to say that. I've just had such an engaging and positive experiences throughout my working career. And I've not practiced directly as a landscape architect. It's been in the related professions, and I think that's a really important thing. And again, I'm going to point to Richard with Jason Longhurst, for example, who works at Bradford, is not working as a practicing landscape architect, but clearly his influence has been demonstrated through Bradford as well as through Ali's. I think the Landscape Institute are doing our very, very best to sort of look at how we can encourage more diverse and not just sort of young undergraduates into graduate courses to train to be landscape architects and landscape professionals. We need a sort of rallying call across the landscape profession. We're short of ecologists, we're short of tree surgeons, we're short of arboriculturists, we're short of soil scientists. And I think if we are really going to take climate change and aspects around biodiversity crisis, we absolutely have to make sure that people are finding these professions attractive. I think there's aspects around pay. I think there's aspects around the cost of university courses and how difficult it is to actually make that step in, particularly if you're on low incomes. I think we've got a real issue with diversity in our profession. We've got a lot of work to do. And I think one easy way, because this is a generational thing, to sort of ensure that more universities don't drop landscape as a degree course, because we've seen a drop off as well, is apprentices. And that's one thing that we're pushing really, really hard with local authorities, with our registered practices, with the private sector, to not just take 1 or 2, why not take 30? We've got lots of level 7 apprentice accredited courses that apprenticeships can go into, and it isn't all about just landscape design. There's landscape planning, there's landscape science, there's landscape research. And speaking, Bridget, who's actually been on the coalface, shall we say, of working in higher education. I'm sure she's got something that she wanted to add to that. But yes, encourage everybody to sort of work in landscape. It's the best job ever.
Brilliant. Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much to all our speakers. So I'll hand back to Leslie. Thank you so much.
Great. Oh, what a super session. It's been so interesting. And thanks a lot for your questions. And it just comes to me to thank you all again. If you want to get in contact with us, here's our details. And thanks again for your participation and all the speakers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.